And we're waiting for the recording guy to start the recording. Okay. Ready? Okay. Our next speaker is an expert in high-energy lasers and high-energy systems. He works at SARA, Scientific Applications Research Association. They do a lot of esoteric work, a lot of work for the government, and he has some ideas that have just really astounded me over the years, particularly his understanding of Einstein's concepts and his understanding of what may be influencing the higher and lower ages. So will you please give a warm welcome to John Dering.
I'm going to start off by asking the dumb question, can everybody hear me? All right. All right. By the way, they really did warn everybody. There's apparently this button on this thing that if you push it, something catastrophic happens. I'm going to push it at the end of the talk, so let's see what... we have a lot to cover, and I thought I would just start off. I've never really done this before, sort of kind of make a quasi-political statement. It's really not political, but I just want to say one thing. Over the last couple of days, I've heard a lot of comments, and rightfully so, we deserve it, about scientists and the big mess that the world is in. But I'll tell you a quick story. When I was in high school and junior high, I used to hang around with all the weirdos. And the weirdos were the guys that you could go talk to out on the playground about Atlantis, and we read all those kind of books, and you know, the Frank Edwards books on weird phenomena, UFOs. And then later on in high school, we kind of got into, primarily it was various, you know, amine amide sort of compounds added onto lysergic acid and all that kind of stuff. And I thought, wow, this is great. You know, there's this kind of really unique group of weird thinking people, very free thinking. And as I grew up, those guys all started to get like regular jobs and mortgages and, you know, and it was like, where's all the, you know, the really strange guys? And I finally found the thing I love to do, which is physics. But all this time, there'd been for 15 years, 20 years, this kind of like, where are those free thinkers? And I was in the middle of a military installation, and this guy came over and tapped me on the shoulder, and he said, this guy wants to go to lunch with you alone, and I can't mention the person's name. And, Colonel Alexander took me to, John Alexander took me to lunch, and I suddenly found, oh my God, these are where these guys are now. And all of a sudden, we were right back there on the playground. We were talking about, oh yeah, you heard about that shipboard experiment too, and all of that. So I will tell you that, you know, when Don Spencer had the idea for the high-energy chemical laser, he said it knocked him to his knees. He had a vision. He had a vision of two worlds, one in which there was going to be a catastrophe between the Soviet Union and the United States, and another which might be avoided. And he literally said this dropped him to his knees. And what came through at that point, he said, was this strong prayer that was, he said, like, felt himself enveloping the world, that was, God bless this laser for the good of mankind. And you'll find many scientists that work in those communities actually are the more open-minded, the more willing to talk. I mean, this yoga talk where I work, they think it's great. I mean, everybody there, the president of the company, is into like weird ancient civilizations and all that kind of stuff. It's if you go to the academic community, you're going to find that those are the reincarnated priests from the Middle Ages. All right? I've got a lot to go through, and I want to get to Angie's great new artwork. So look, basically, a lot of you have seen these charts, but Walter told me there'd be quite a few new people here. I'm going to talk about why it is that there is no time to give this talk, but I have to also stand corrected. For the last 2 years, I've been saying, again, Goethe said, you know, and the story I'd been told was that Goethe was, somebody came up and asked this completely impossible to answer quickly philosophical question, you know, about what's the meaning of Faust or something, you know, and he said, I have no time to be brief, and then proceeded to give. Turns out, this is now what I've been told by some angry historians on the internet, it was actually Lord Nelson saying this to his mistress. And it takes on a totally different meaning. And so basically, look, I have no doubt, and also for those of you that didn't hear this comment, by the way, the slide is staying on number 1 here, so, I guess I need to advance this. I don't know anything about computers. I hate the things, to tell you the truth. I think this is a technology that'll soon be gone, by the way. I'm serious. This is, if you knew what's coming, the computer's a thing of the past. It's a ridiculous instrument. But basically, there are no doubt there are a lot of influences, and I do not question that there is going to be some type of profound effects from things like impacts, earthquake events. We also notice how we kind of leave another one of these things off of there, which is we don't always talk about, you know, we got long period comets and periodic increases in comet bombardment, you know, and all that. Yeah, all these things could be caused, but there's another thing that goes on this planet too. I'm not going to get too negative, but let's face it, there have been wars in the past. You all know the line from Robert Oppenheimer when after the bombs were used in Japan, and physicists to this day carry that guilt, myself, every one of us. Sometime not here, but I'll tell you the story about the first time I met a survivor of Hiroshima. And it was, even then, there was that energy of what my predecessors had done. But it happened. And Oppenheimer was asked by the press, is this the first time, you know, meaning, did the Russians or Germans get anywhere close? And he said, no, this is the first time nuclear weapons have been used in a very long time. And as you know, he was a student of the Vedic scriptures. So, and, you know, a lot of this stuff I'm going to just basically kind of go through. I also, by the way, will tell you if you want another really fantastic, flat-out description of the Yuga. This Kalevala epic, the more I'm reading about it, it is really right up there with the Epic of Gilgamesh and the Ramayana and all. I mean, it is one of the world's great traditions. This is from basically Finland. Fantastic accounting of the Golden Age, the Silver Age, and the quest for this thing that was responsible for those ages that we lost. And in what I'm going to talk about is, okay, we've got a binary cycle. And the binary cycle, you know, that's one thing, okay? That puts us into kind of the idea that, okay, there's this orbit that the stars go through, but how exactly would that create the rise and fall of civilization? In addition to which, there are wars and occasional cometary bombardments and earthquakes and tsunamis and all of that. So you got all that going on, but the cycle itself, why would a binary orbit actually cause an influence in consciousness? And so what was postulated, in fact, I'm going to stand back here so I can see the slide too, and then we'll use the laser to kind of point certain things out. Basically, in that book, The Holy Science, which was written by Sri Yukteswar, the great Hindu Vedic sage, who really what the Holy Science was about was he took the just thousands and thousands of the Vedas and the Upanishads and the Shastras, and he cleaned it up and he put it into a simple text, and he basically just took it down to its core essence, because it was high time to do that. A lot of the, you know, the Hindus went through their own Kali Yuga too. I mean, the whole world did. And they went through the same thing where they just, wrote and wrote and wrote the way they did in the Catholic monasteries, and all these interpretations. And finally, it was time for it to get simplified and made clear. And basically what he said is, look, this is caused by precession is actually a result of this orbit. During that orbit, we're getting closer to, I initially in these charts said a third object. But very interesting. He doesn't say a third object. He says a center of rotation. And then as we move away from that, the center of rotation is the source of a powerful field. Now, he describes it as the universal magnetic field. Remember, that book was written in 1894. Okay, this is not a term that would have made any sense, but I think we do have a term that comes a little bit closer to it. Think unified field, the sum total, a field that is the sum total of all of the physical forces that we understand in nature, the underlying thing that basically gives rise to, if you will, breathes life into electromagnetism, gravity, the nuclear fields in this fifth force. Basically, I had an artist friend who's an MIT graduate. I explained the Yuga cycle to her and asked her how she would kind of interpret this. So she came up with the idea of saying, hey, look, let's think of a guy who's on a car trip. And we're going to go through 3 versions of this car trip, but you'll get kind of the idea. The basic thing is, and I'm using the laser, okay, the guy's driving perpetually around this elliptical track. That represents the orbit that our sun, and basically that's our solar system and the sun and all the planets. So basically, here we're really far away from this radio station. We're getting crummy reception on the music. With me, it would be Cream. Others, they're like different bands. But it's really, different thing. And if you're in New Mexico, you hear country western, and God forgive them, but I mean that's just the way it is. And then as you get really close, the reception gets great, and then as you recede, the reception gets further away. So think of this. Okay, now we'll go over to the next one. Now let's give this actually a purpose. Let's say it's no longer a radio station that's just sending out music. It's sending out information. It's sending out some type of signal, which is telling something on board that solar system, the human consciousness, if you will, how well it can function. It's putting out the timing pulses, for example, for a computer. So when we're far away, the computer can't really do much at all. But when we get up really close, the computer's solving complex problems from physics. The bottom line is what this is saying is that as we get into a stronger and clearer reception close to this third object, as we're going to call it at the moment, and then finally, in the last one, let's just say that the computer has some sort of special attachment that's sensitive to a magnetic field. Works better in the presence of that strong field and gets weak when it moves away. And you'll notice there are fields around some of these other rocks. Well, what's that? It's the other fixed stars. It's the other stars that play roles. This is astrology, basically. In other words, yeah, there are influences from other nearby and even further away star systems, but there's this primary power source called the grand center, which is kind of like, if you might say, it's the local power plant. And these other things, other constellations, maybe Orion, they're sort of favorable because they kind of help, if you will, channel or waveguide or resonate with some of that energy, but they're not really the primary source, the primary cause. And as we get closer to this object, civilization advances. As we move further away, it declines. At the time I did these charts, I'm referring to this as electromagnetic energy because, as you know, here's an example. Electromagnetic energy, we are discovering, does have a fantastic range of effects on the human nervous system, all the way from the extremely low frequency, even up into now we're finding out optical frequencies, actually getting into the brain, actually shining light in the brain can change brain chemistry. So a simple model is basically this. We got this mystery object or region of space. Here's our binary orbit. I'm imagining we're orbiting a heavier object, so it doesn't have to do as much motion. Here's our sun. Imagine all the solar systems compressed in that. We're pretty far away at this point, actually at about the bottom of the cycle, at our furthest point. Here, we're at our closest now. The two stars have swung in. We're pretty much at our closest approach. We're now immersed more strongly in the field of this object that's over here. All right? And this is about actually where we are right now. Sorry, the bad news, as Walter said, 6:30 a.m., try more like about 4:45 a.m. We're coming into an age that is definitely not the Dark Age, all right? And we are coming into a time where there's going to be an increasing interest in look at this. This sort of conference wasn't happening 30 or 40 years ago. It was impossible to imagine this kind of interest in this, or that there would be, scientists that I work with at work, I show them pictures of these Egyptian anomalies, and they're like, oh yeah, that was done with some type of ultrasound drill. I mean, they're not even questioning, because it is so obvious that the stuff that's in the textbooks is just nonsense. It's just made up by people that have never had to actually do work. If you've actually had to cut stone, let alone move 350-ton stone blocks as they have in the Andes, you have a real appreciation of energy and momentum and all. I mean, this idea of pulling things around on vines, I don't care how many slaves you got, it just doesn't work that way. You need a concentrated source of energy. So, thank you. So I'm going to move through these, but basically here's the idea. We get close into this grand center, this source of powerful field. It's not quite the way I would draw the cycle, but you sort of get the idea. Where the bottom of the cycle is approximately 500 AD. As the cycle begins to go up, more and more of this influence is awakening, on average, a greater number of people on Earth. Not everybody at once, not everybody to the same degree at once. It's like magnetization in a magnet that I'll talk about in a moment. It doesn't just happen smoothly, and that's unfortunate because it produces some side effects. But at any rate, as we get closer, we reach a peak in capacity, and then that declines. The good news is the planet spends about 75 or 80% of its time in the higher ages, or in really fairly enlightened times. The bad news is, guess where you were born? So, and this chart's not quite accurate, because this actually, it's from 500 AD to 1700 AD is the ascending Dark Age. Human development's about a quarter developed. Then we go up to basically about 4100 AD. The time span, it's not quite spaced, because this is really a 1200-year period, then 24, 36, 4800. But again, you get the idea that it's that cycle. I tend to draw it as this kind of sinusoidal curve, because I think that way more, as part of the cycle, human consciousness is on, you might say mental capacity is going up. Again, average. There are always above average people. There will always be those that range everywhere from the level of true ignorance to those that have enlightenment, even in the darkest of ages. And we see those examples. Bioelectromagnetism is becoming such an area. I'm going to include, and I want to get to this before my talk is over. This is really what I want to talk about. This is what I've been looking at in the last year. One thing I will say, this is probably a good enough time to say it. No, it isn't. We'll save that, because I'll get myself really worked up, and then I'm gonna basically say something about modern science, about what I really think about some of these people. The human brain has that big a response bandwidth. It is an unbelievable thing. We joke in electrical engineering about, if only we had a spectrum analyzer that worked from DC down, DC continuous, DC current, up to visible light. The human brain does this. The human brain is a fantastic electromagnetic processing device. It is unbelievable. And what's more, experiments done by Richard Dickhout that were initially sponsored by certain agencies in which he generated pulsed magnetic fields at frequencies that corresponded to brain rhythms, but they were 100,000 times weaker than the Earth's ambient magnetic field. So we live in a fairly weak magnetic field. His stuff was worked 100,000 times below that, and these monkeys' brains would show a walk-up in brain frequency for 36 hours after only 20 minutes exposure to that pulsed field. And the next day, as they would drag them towards that Helmholtz coil, those animals would go nuts. I myself did an experiment which to this day, I regret. I experimented on myself with a device that drives electromagnetic fields up and down the spine very rapidly at about 90 million times a second. Don't try and do yoga electromagnetically. The body's not equipped for it at this stage. My lab technician and I swore we were going to dismantle that thing. It was a big mistake. Do it the way it's. If you want to advance your consciousness, do it the way the ancients discovered through those Vedic, powerful yogic meditation techniques. We're not going to get clever and invent some sort of samadhi machine. I know there are people that claim that, but it doesn't work that way, folks. Sorry. And although these do have profound effects on the human brain, bioelectromagnetism is getting much more recognized. You might note this statement down here, and you don't need a sledgehammer to see these effects. Well, I mean, you can get effects with the sledgehammer. I've seen those. I've seen what high-intensity electromagnetic energy can do to living systems, and believe me, there are effects. They're not subtle at all. There's a type of electromagnetic pulse generating device called an E3. You don't need to hook that up to something to see effects. Fantastically subtle fields. Why is subtle so important? Because something out in space very far away, the field's probably fallen off in intensity, might still have a very profound effect on the human population. There are preferred frequencies where, the brain works better. Benjamin Franklin, by the way, who did 3 experiments. We all know about the kite experiment. We don't know, this actually was called the Philadelphia experiment. It was a fantastic forerunner of another experiment where he dragged an electrified chain across his forehead, apparently right across the area where some people call the spiritual eye. And, the chain links going by so many links per second, depending on how fast he was dragging the chain, he saw all kinds of lights and patterns and colors in his head. He did another experiment involving, which actually was the most dangerous one, which I'll talk about when we get to the Einstein stuff. Franklin had unbelievable good karma. He did 3 things that should have killed him, and the third one, when you hear what he did, it was just, outright insanity, but he survived it. Lindstrom's work will, in time, become far more understood. We heard yesterday a great deal about the effects of electrostatic fields and the telluric currents on seeds. Lindstrom's work actually showed some remarkable stuff. Those are very low frequency, by the way, relatively low frequency. Tesla, I might add, looked at some higher frequency effects. Lindstrom did experiments like this where he noted that up in the northern latitudes, plants grew better during high auroral activity. And he put together this idea. He was the first one to sort of suggest that biological processes were actually linked to something other than just the regular seasons, that the electrical activity of the sun, which he speculated was causing the aurora, was somehow stimulating plant growth through basically ion transport into the soil, driving nutrient preferred ions into the roots, and then actually also helping the plants grow. He found there was actually what he called the dark side and the night side growth cycles on plants, something I'd like to follow up. And of course, Bose, so far ahead of his time, it's just ridiculous. You see this thing over here and you laugh at it, and then you realize it's a quarter wave twist. It's basically a quarter wave polarization plate made out of jute because it was the only thing he could get in India. Working at 60 gigahertz, frequencies that we're just really now getting into for weapons and high-frequency radar. Basically, all of his work was done to show that plants and plant materials, plant threads, fibers, are channels or guides for electromagnetic fields. Bose actually did radio communication prior to Tesla or Marconi, but he had no interest in taking credit for it. It's a fantastic story about this man's life, what he did. Tesla, really, what I will simply say is, of all the mysteries about Tesla, there's a fantastic amount of just absolute nonsense, garbage, and junk about Tesla out there. If you read anything that starts off with scalar waves, throw it out. That person doesn't know what they're talking about. Tesla was talking about a type of electrical propagation that is different from our own. This is why his experiments are so bloody difficult to reproduce. It is not a conventional diffusion current going through the ground. It is a coherent plasmon. If you saw the article on the cover of Scientific American recently, and there was this thing about plasmons, the next thing in electronics, Tesla was doing that down in the low-frequency radio domain. But what of greatest interest is, we did three-dimensional lumped, actually not lumped, full distributed wave transmission line resonator analysis for all of the passages in the Great Pyramid. And if it wasn't for that cracked passage that they apparently deliberately put through there, the pyramid is set up to oscillate at one of Tesla's frequencies, which corresponds to an Earth resonance. The only difference is Tesla is talking about electrical resonances, but the acoustic chambers are oscillating at sound. Well, I have a feeling of what's going on, but it is still a puzzle. It's odd, but the pyramid is tuned to select out all other frequencies so that tremendously high acoustic intensities at Earth resonant frequencies where they electrical could be built up inside the pyramid. The pyramid, when it was in full acoustic mode oscillation, I believe, you wouldn't have lasted in there a quarter of a second. The fields acoustic fields would have been that high. They're beyond lethal. Here's Tesla's work. Of course, he loved to do these photos. You all know the story. He wasn't really sitting in the chair when the picture was taken. Brilliant man. I've looked very, very deeply into Tesla's work, probably next to Jim Coram, and I will just tell you that Tesla said if no other picture of him was ever preserved, it would be this picture with this coil, not any of this other stuff. This, by the way, for those of you who think this is the Tesla coil, how wrong you are. That's the third coil. The Tesla coil's out here, primary's out here, secondary's here, and there's this odd, you can just barely see it in some photos, heavy cable that runs up. It took us 20 years to figure out what that is, and that's the whole trick. And if you don't know what he was doing, then basically you'll never get his results. He said the arcs and sparks, said if your coil is producing that, then you aren't even in the regime. When you got Tesla's regime going, you'll see something quite different around the coil. And we saw that this last year. It's a series of concentric rings. Bioelectromagnetic effects. Look, there's a lot of work that went on, to be honest, during the Cold War. I'm sure you're aware of this. The Russians were very, very far ahead of us. I brought a book called Pathological Effects of Radio Waves. It was basically smuggled out of the Soviet Union. It is a tremendously interesting area. There's that story I told last year, the guy that did the theremin, that electrical musical instrument where you run your hand up and down the pole that's actually a transmission line resonator. He was kidnapped by the KGB from New York City to work on radio wave weapons in the 1940s. This work about Richard Dickhout, I talked about that. The brain is incredibly sensitive. Electromagnetic interaction types of interest. Well, you could have a lot of things going on. There's the static electric field that we have with the Earth. There's the fact that, if you move through an electric field, you induce, by law of special relativity, a magnetic field. Magnetic field appears when you move relative to an electric field, or when electric charge moves relative to you. Accelerated or time varying, you get into inductive. questions, a lot of things begin to occur as to, well, how exactly is it that that orbit, when we're going through this cyclical orbit, you can think of it as non-illustrative as this may seem. Here's a generator of sorts spinning around, this coil spinning around. This is a magnet. Each time the coil slices by that magnet, you get a current induced. There's a voltage EMF. All right, I'm arguing you can kind of draw a similar picture where each time the Earth slices closer to this field, and it may be that since it appears as though the higher ages occur when we're not only at our closest approach, but when we're coming in at our fastest, it maybe it's a time rate of change effect. In other words, it's not just that we're getting closer, but we're moving faster through it, which would be an inductive effect. And again, there's the rise and fall. That, by the way, is the actual computer pattern for the ages of human rise and fall of consciousness. It's called a cycloid of revolution. And it is effectively one of the shapes that you can create by drawing, putting a pencil on the edge of a circle and wheeling it across the room. Interesting pattern related to elliptical or quasi-elliptical orbits. This one I'm going to skip because I've talked about those. Geophysical fields, you know, there was a lot of work done at sites that are not necessarily considered to be sacred, but are considered to be, you know, unusual phenomena places. There's you've heard of the ranch up in Utah and all of that, and I've had the honor or dishonor or whatever of being in some of those locations to investigate some of those phenomena. The moment you enter those areas, you feel the hairs going up on the back of your neck. Raises fantastic questions. The indigenous peoples that have been there for a long time, they know about this phenomena. So what is it? Is it a brain-induced hallucination, or is it that the electromagnetic fields are simply making us more aware of something that's there? You know, it's a fascinating question, you know, which came first, the tapeworm or the intestine, you know? It's and the human brain, interestingly enough, has some preferred frequencies it likes down at this low frequency range, and it is it's kind of interesting that you know, these frequencies correspond to these global planetary resonances. So one question is, maybe as we get as our sun and its family of planets gets closer to this grand center, it's just exciting the fields. It's, in other words, the Earth is ringing, is actually acting as an antenna or a tuned oscillator that is picking up the field from the grand center. And the planet is basically, if you will, humming, and we are being sentient beings with electromagnetically sensitive brains walking around on that Earth are picking that up. You heard Walter talk about the Mu chamber. Well, the fascinating thing is the frequencies that she was cutting people off of. And by the way, Mu, you wonder where that comes, that's an alloy. And it's an alloy that's particularly good at shutting off magnetic fields. It's no problem to shut off the DC electrostatic fields. It's the low frequency fields that are a nightmare to get rid of. And Mu is very good, basically, Mu metal is very good at basically blocking those. So people go in there, no Schumann resonances and none of these other modes can get in there, and they start feeling bad. The fields are brought back on, kind of normal states of cognitive operation on tests return. Then the fields are increased, and wow, all of a sudden the person is basically performing better. Soviet researchers allege that it's the fact that the astronauts are above the ionosphere, they're above those electromagnetic, you know, because the ionosphere basically serves as the trap for the Schumann resonances and some of these other low frequencies, that the body deterioration is not just because we're out in space and we're not getting the exercise that we should because we're working against gravity, because they've got those guys doing all kinds of exercises, and their health is. Another thing that the astronauts will not talk about openly is that oftentimes when they come back from an extended orbit, they are depressed for months. It's as if they've been out of something. And what we proposed to NASA, but they just weren't ready to hear it, was just put low-frequency generators that mimic the Earth's fields. You know, basically, they're at least to some extent, maybe kind of recreate a little bit more of the Earth environment. So, orbit, basically, the idea is sun gets closer to the grand center. The sun, the planets in our solar system, Jupiter, for example, has got this fantastic magnetic field. The sun does. And they act actually as antennas to pick up waves impinging from space. Those in turn may act to actually set up these terrestrial resonances, which here you see the Earth, the ionosphere above it, and that kind of periodic lumpiness was Angie's way, and the bands was Angie's way of sort of indicating that the Earth is actually in some type of electromagnetic resonance. And then finally, the, if you will, oscillators that are in our brain are picking up the fact that our planetary systems are now acting like better antennas. They're antennas, they're getting closer to the source field, they're picking up more of it, and our brains are getting a bigger dose. There are several types of modes. Walter mentioned the alpha modes. Schumann resonances, I'm not much particularly interested. The Zenach-Sommerfeld, these really ought to be called Tesla modes. I think they're fascinating, and I think the reason that they are fascinating is it is those modes, these Zenach-Sommerfeld ones, these ones are of interest for this cycle for three reasons. Number one, the entire planet rings at over, if you strike the Earth with a Schumann resonance, you get 3, maybe 4 cycles before it just duds out. It's like striking a clay pot. You get a plunk, you know, and then that's it. But you hit the Earth with one of the Tesla Zenach or Sommerfeld frequencies, and for 1,000 or 2,000 cycles, and this is based on NASA data from 1985 when they were looking at those sprites and blue jets, the planet will ring for 1,000, I mean literally in minutes, just from one excitation event. Tesla, believe me, was right on when he was talking about this planet for only a few horsepower of investment of electrical power can be made to tremble with the vibrations of a human voice, the entire planet. And, interestingly enough, what is the fundamental cycle of the planet of the Earth? 12 of those cycles is 1 second. Isn't it interesting that this whole business of, 12 hours, 24 hours, 24,000 years, this 60, all of that based on cycles of 12, the fundamental time constant for this planet in electromagnetic oscillation, 12 of those is 1 second. You'd kind of wonder if maybe the ancients based our time system on the, what else would you, think about it, what to base, let the Earth define the time constant for that local planet. And in fact, it's not exactly 12 seconds, it's a little, or 12 cycles a second, it's a little bit off. Fascinating thing is, changed our system so that that is actually 1 second is actually 12 of those Earth oscillations, and then take a look at the number of seconds in a year. Homework assignment, you'll find a very interesting number pops up. Electromagnetic, I didn't tell you what the Tesla frequency is. I will at the end of the talk. Electromagnetic fields influence the brain, all right. So all these things are going on. And we know there's another thing that can be done too. You can put seeds in between the poles of a strong magnet and then plant them and they grow better. You can expose seeds to electrostatic fields. You can keep the electrostatic fields. Remember, a friend of mine put together this simple circuit, and the plants treated with the electromagnetic grid, and they begin to get gigantic. I mean, you get these like science fiction plants. This is not, and this, by the way, Lindstrom says the same thing. He said he had this one section, and the plants are more nutritive. And a friend got this idea from reading the Bible, because he noted that in a section prior to the reference of the flood, there was no mention of clouds. He did some quick guessing on electrostatic field conditions, and he came up with this experiment. Christian fundamentalist that was very open-minded. They do exist. Some conclusions. The brain uses these frequencies. We are hardwired. All of that, yeah, it's part of the biosphere and all of that. Those are electromagnetic frequencies. meaning that they're a type of frequencies that our science is currently capable of understanding. But in that book, The Holy Science, it doesn't say that it's the source of electromagnetic fields. It says it's the source of the universal magnetic field. And if you want a better definition, what is the universal magnetic field? It says it is the field which gives rise to 5 basic types of electricities, each of which manifests as different physical forces in this universe, one of which is gravity. Well, wait a second, that sounds an awful lot like this universal magnetic field is a little bit more like what we might call the unified field. And so, having talked a little bit about this, that the brain requires these frequencies and all of that, I've got some speculations that I'd like to go through, and then I'm going to get into the last part of my talk, because I am coming up on my time limit. Number 1, the cycle does not go smoothly, even without the catastrophes that are no doubt brought about by an occasional asteroid impact or alien invasion or God knows what's gone on in the past on this planet, all kinds of fun stuff. First of all, you get magnetic hysteresis. What that means is that as we go through one of those higher age cycles, it is a tendency for the brains, which you might think of as the little magnetic domain centers making up this great population of humanity, to remain locked up in the magnetized or higher consciousness state. This accounts for the fact that the ancients, even though they were fairly far down into the Dwapara Yuga, are still putting such an emphasis on silver and golden age ideals. Whereas we, who are coming up this way, we're now at the other side of hysteresis. We've got Kali Yuga hanging on to us like you wouldn't believe. There's a thing called the Barkhausen effect. These things don't come smoothly. They come in discontinuous jumps, and those jumps themselves produce ringing. I have a diagram. And this could suggest, what is the Barkhausen implication? That everything goes along kind of sort of much the same for a while, and then all of a sudden there's what? A revolution. Or somebody gets a bright idea like National Socialism, and we end up with a world war. There are these sudden jumps in consciousness for good or for bad. I'm going to give you a quick example here. You look at this. The ideal is basically the red. The actual is the blue. It's not quite as exaggerated as I would have liked, but what it means is on the coming down cycle, we stay a little bit in a higher state of consciousness, characteristic of that hysteresis effect. Number 2, Barkhausen. If you really look at the course of history, those little jumps and bumps there, those stair steps, which is actually true. If you take a piece of iron and you immerse it in a magnetic field and you begin to turn it up and you listen, with a microphone, you can actually hear the domains flipping. You hear this like pop, 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 pop. It sounds like static. Because what's going on is, it isn't like the magnetization just is like this nice uniform thing that sweeps through. It happens in one little pocket. This is why last year somebody got kind of upset and they said, well, why did machines show up in this ascending Dwapara Yuga in Great Britain? Why was there such an industrial... Luck of the draw. It just happened there this time. Next Yuga, who knows where it'll be. All right, it's just the conditions were more favorable. That domain kicked off. There was no statement whatsoever about that there's anybody special or unique or anything. The brain structure of the human race is pretty much the same, and it has been for a very long time. Somebody asked yesterday how many cycles we've been through. According to the Vedic texts, 4,000 of these 24,000-year cycles. So basically, and we got one other wonderful little thing that goes on. There are other cycles. There are grand cycles and grander cycles. So the little red wiggle, that's our 24,000-year cycle, but it's said in the Vedic text there are several of these other longer cycles that have their own Kali. These are related to things I'll talk about in a moment. Well, guess what? We just happen to be at a time when we're at the bottom of the bottom of the bottom, and we're at a really, really just a beautiful time to have been born. And indeed it is, because if you can make spiritual effort, self-improvement, whatever you want to call it, personal growth, in this type of environment, you're doing great. And I'm just going to ask this. Has anybody else here had one of those years this year? Because I want to tell you, this crap I've been through this year, I mean, you wouldn't believe the stuff that has just gone, you know. So don't give up hope, all right? And when you hear the things about the planet being in this dark age, also look at it as an opportunity, because in the higher ages, people get a little bit caught up with how nice things are. The fact is, sometimes, you know, if you spend all your time at Disneyland, you never really get around to taking care of business. You might want to think about that. But what is really going on? Well, this is the point at which I'm going to say, I'm going to start talking a little bit. This is going to be the last little bit of my talk here. Vibration can create wonderful patterns. Here's a copper plate, 0.5 meter in diameter, 50 centimeters, exposed to 16,500 hertz vibration. Sand was sprinkled on it. This pattern forms. It looked like a mandala, and you see these things in temple bells. Well, you know what's happened. The Chinese, who are a little bit less closed-minded, have taken a look at some old temple gongs. Yes, the patterns that are inscribed on them are their resonant modes. And you can't get that by just striking the gong. It has to be continuously excited, meaning something like an electric piezo. You know, I mean, in other words, I'm just suggesting another artifact indirectly to understand that this sort of pattern should show up on a sound-producing instrument. This actually is generated by sound, and I think some of the patterns on ancient gongs were done so. I mention this, though, because I'm about to take a jump into how I actually am viewing the grand center this time around. When we look at the way the sand organizes itself, you find it actually flows as currents. This is the wonderful work of Hans Jenny. He was the first one to really study this phenomena, and he took these photos, and unfortunately I don't have movies, but he said, you know, you got these little zones that appear where the sand collects. Sand collects in those zones where the vibration is the least. Those are called the antinodal zones, or the nodes, the places basically where the plate is the most stationary, and where it's the most vibrating, bucking up and down the surface, it kicks the sand out. But he found that the sand arranges itself actually in these currents, and these are just absolutely similar to the modes that you see in things like laser cavities. Like in laser cavities, a lot of people think laser beams are these perfect little spots, but many lasers will project spots that have several, like a geometric row of dots, and the electric field polarization in one dot will be this way, in the one adjacent it will be like this, like this. I mean, nature repeats these microwave waveguides. You get these same structures over and over again. Oops, we've got audio-visual problems. I didn't hit that button, by the way, I want you to know. So, no laser works. Well, while I'm waiting for this to come back up, because I'm sure Jeff will take care of it, I'm going to go ahead and kind of give the little sort of chewing out that I wanted to give. We spend a lot of time in the last day talking about the great respect that we have for ancient cultures. One of the things that ancient cultures and the indigenous cultures, particularly those like the Dogon, and I might add another one, you want to get the true scoop on what was going on in Mexico 2,000, 3,000, 4,000 years ago. Talk to those Tarahumara Indians, the ones that went to live in the caves to preserve their traditions. The Tarahumara, it's in the Copper Canyon. If those of you that don't know what Copper Canyon is, look it up on there's a canyon network of canyons in the Chihuahua province of Mexico. Chihuahua is that region of Mexico which has got all the weird phenomena. By the way, anybody see those pictures recently in those magazines of those giant gypsum crystals? Where's Robert Schock? See here? Yeah. Apparently those are real. When the first time I thought of them, I thought those were, you know, like some, but that's in those caves. Those caves happen to be flooded. I'd like to basically say the following. Ancient cultures did one thing. They listened to their elders. Occasionally, a great wise man or a shaman would come among them, and they really paid attention to him. And we had one. We have a lot of scientists, and we have a lot of career scientists. And I wouldn't give you 2 cents for most of them. And that includes 90% of the group up at Caltech. But we had a guy here, his name you might have heard, named Albert Einstein, who has been slapped in the face about as much as I can take at this point. And the final blow was something in Scientific American that had the nerve to say, modern physics shows that things like, that maybe something like the ether, the pre-Einsteinian ether, might actually explain certain phenomena. You know, you may have seen that analogy where they're building wave tanks and vortice tanks to simulate black holes and all this kind of stuff, you know. And the Einstein, you know, threw out the ether. Maybe he was really wrong. Einstein didn't throw the ether out. This is the most unbelievable story. Special relativity was an attempt to basically, you know what the paper Special Relativity is called? On the electrodynamics of moving bodies. It's basically a way of resolving Maxwell's equations with motion. Then comes general relativity, which he says is a better approximation, and then comes the unified field theory. And the unified field theory he worked on in various forms till the end of his life, and that field theory they considered throwing out, and yet it is almost exactly parallel to what you will see in the Vedic texts. It says that we have a subspace that is unapproachable by any atomic particle, vibration, wave phenomena that we know, but it is the source of a kind of a magnetism, you might describe it, a grand unified field. That comes into this four-dimensional space-time and manifests as electromagnetism, gravity, as the two nuclear fields in a fifth force. It's five. It's five, just like the Vedic texts say 5 electricities. They called them electricities. We could call them fundamental interactions. But it goes further. Einstein predicted, if you look at his discussion, there are additional gravitational terms. There are fluidic and viscosity terms that come back into space, not like the 19th century ether. So the way I'm going to talk about the grand center in the little bit of time that I've got left is the following. Inside of large tornadoes, you probably have seen these things now on Discovery Channel, there are smaller tornadoes. It turns out those are the powerhouses. When you see one of those half-a-mile wide tornadoes, when I think Angie did some art, you know, what you typically see if you're out in the Midwest is you see this kind of thing, but what's really going on inside is much more complex. You've got a descending downdraft, and the updraft is actually localized in these small vortices. And actually, those suction vortices usually are separated out more, but so be it. The flow diagram for this thing is like this. It's a downdraft along the core of the tornado and an updraft on the edges. That downdraft was not verified until 1995. It was predicted by Nikola Tesla, interestingly, who was fascinated by tornadoes. The point being is that if we have a vorticity model, if we have ether, if we have space as a sort of a fluid, then maybe the term a center of rotation might be something that we can get a little bit from, like this phenomena that Hans Jenny showed. He sprinkled lycodium powder onto a plate, excited it with ultrasound. Not quite a galaxy-type structure, but you can see some sort of spiral arms type showing. This entire pattern rotates, and every one of those spheres rotates on its own axis, and some of them paired up and actually formed like binaries. This would be predicted in Einstein's unified field theory. This book, if you can get it, get it. This is, in my opinion, this book, go through it, find it, whatever it takes. This This book is almost impossible to get, and we owe an apology to Einstein. Yes, he had the nuclear fields in, okay? And yes, he had quantum mechanics. And it is an unbelievable thing that I've talked with people that, oh no, if you do that Einstein theory, you just get this thing that's kind of like a bad version of general relativity and Maxwell's equations. If you throw away the higher order terms, and Einstein said this is the one type of theory you can't. You can do it on general relativity, but you have to keep those higher order terms. As far back as the 1923 time frame, Schouten was speculating, hey, the electromagnetic field, they're just vortex structures in this more fundamental subspace. This man right here, we could do an entire conference on him. This was a giant. Take Nikola Tesla's electrical engineering genius and Albert Einstein's genius for understanding space-time. This man walked around the Earth, took a hiking tour in the 1930s, went through India in search of holy men, became the director of research for General Electric. To Johnny from Gabe is not me, it's our director of business for Sarah. Dr. John Moore is very old now, in his 90s. But he was the one that Gabe Crone hired to do a review of this. Crone had to explain certain small perturbations in electrical machines. He came up with his own mathematics. No other way it could be done with Maxwell's equations and Lagrangian. What emerged? Einstein's unified field theory. The small perturbations were being caused by induced gravitational and torsion fields. In 1943 at Princeton, the mathematician Banish Hoffman literally burst into a lecture and said, we now have experimental verification of Einstein's unified field theory as the result of Gabriel Crone's work. So I asked John Moore, I said, what did you guys work on during World War II? He goes, it was radar countermeasures for ships. And I was like, okay, I think I know the experiment you're referring to. And then I went on, and then later on, John took me on some personal private lunches, and I heard that they didn't reproduce that. They didn't. This work isn't still going on. You know why it got stopped? Because the upper brass in the Navy didn't believe what they were reporting. And secondly, there was a war going on. This man, when he was in India, one night at an ashram, while he was on his hiking trip, had a vision that came to him of seeing the fundamental underlying unity of Judaism and Hinduism. I mean, this is a remarkable guy. When he was at Angkor, he spent a week at Angkor exploring the ruins in the 1930s, found a British tourist to take a picture of him, and he said, darn it, when that picture was developed, showing me standing where that main spire was, everything was there, but where I should have been, there was just this blob of white light with spokes radiating like a wheel. I was like, I think it did take a picture of you, but anyway, fantastic guy. His textbooks, the ones that are available now, they've taken out all the unified field theory section. 5 electricities that they talked about, I think they are related to things we see in solid state physics, because they also mention these as being related to currents that are flow in the 5 senses. We're now finding that actually these things actually flow in our brain. It's not just simple diffusion, electrochemical currents. More on this perhaps next year. And here's what I'm finally getting to. I believe the grand center, I believe our galaxy is like one of those multiple vortex tornadoes, that there are actually organized centers of rotation, too small to be seen by telescopes now. They're obscured. They're like the early suction vortices. It took 50 years before people realized there were multiple vortices in tornadoes. They thought that damage, they couldn't explain why a mile-wide tornado would leave one building untouched. It didn't understand that there were these localized centers. So to get you some idea of what I'm saying here is that here's the galaxy, about 100,000 light years. We jump down a factor of 100 in scale to 1,000. There's one of these powerful centers of, it happens to look like the Pleiades, but at any rate, for around 1,000 light years around it, it's darn that Angie, she's just too liberal in her interpretation on this stuff. But it basically acts, if you will, as the command center, the power center for that region of the galaxy. And then down on a scale even smaller would be our binary system, where we see a nice bright star, which actually has a white dwarf companion just there off on the side, which is Sirius, and that being our sun. This type of vortex structure, I will simply say, does come out of the early unified field theory papers. I'm not going to go into the math here. I'm working on, at Sarah, I will conclude with one thing the next year. We have a genius at Sarah named Peter Ming. Peter Ming, I told him, I said, I can't work through this math. It's 64 sets of tensor differential equations, and you have to keep the higher order terms. He's written the code. And this is the first code that's ever been generated where it actually plots, using Einstein's unified field theory, torsion and flow of space-time and all those kind of things. And we plugged in, just as a joke, we plugged in some current flows that we predicted might be associated with the search for a certain type of propulsion system, and there we see space-time circulating around in the field shape that we would like. It also helped to have some photos that are not in general public access, but we had to take some guesses as to what certain parts were on things. But the beauty of this theory is that I suspect, maybe not quite, you're not going to see a photo that looks like that of another galaxy. These things are going to be small. They're going to be about, they're going to be embedded tiny features, and there may be many of them. Magnetic centers, and what is pouring out of this is actually not just a powerful electromagnetic field. It is the raw creative field, Brahma, referred to in Sri Yukteswara's book. It is the field, that which gives rise to electricity, gravity, magnetism, all of the forces that we see in this physical universe. And it is possibly for that reason that the ancients so deeply revered that otherwise uninteresting little patch of sky. For those, one final thing I will suggest for those of you, find a book by a woman, and I'm trying to remember her name. It's Munya. She's from Australia, and it is the Seven Sisters of the Pleiades. Read about the world cultures, the fact that Pleiades show up everywhere, just like in Hamlet's Mill, constant. The Pleiades, the stories of the Pleiades and the lost civilization. The Aboriginal word for the Pleiades means the turning point, or the center of rotation. And that basically concludes my talk. So thank you very much.